Hi everybody, Jonah here with Pt.2 Missions, and thank you so much for tuning in for another weekly Devo. I'm happy that you're here. Today we are continuing our series about God's promises and our response to them. And last week, like I told you, I'm going to be focusing on the example that Moses and Aaron and the children of Israel set when they were being delivered up out of Egypt. So not just in the wilderness, but that whole process of Moses returning to Israel and telling them that God was going to deliver them, and then the plagues throughout Egypt, and then ultimately their deliverance and their time in the wilderness. And last week we read a scripture and kind of explained a little bit of the preface, like the time before the plagues were going to come. And so this week we're actually still going to stick with those scriptures, because if you'll remember, last week I said there was something I wanted to expand upon a little bit more, but I didn't want that video to be too long, right? So we've got a couple of points out of last week's scriptures, and if you want to go back and read them, it's pretty much Exodus, the last part of Exodus chapter 4, and then all of Exodus chapter 5. And just to give you a little overview, remember at the end of Exodus chapter 4, Moses comes back to Israel with his brother Aaron, and he delivers the news to the children of Israel that God has sent him as their deliverer, that he's going to free them and bring them out of the land of Egypt. And they believe Moses and Aaron, and they rejoice, and it says at the very last verse, it says that they bowed and they worshiped the Lord. Then in chapter 5, Moses brings the word for the very first time to Pharaoh, tells them everything God had said when he encountered the burning bush, right? And then shows him the signs and things like that. And Moses completely rejects it. Pharaoh completely rejects it, and he puts harder labor upon the people of Israel. So now they have to go and gather their own straw to make their own bricks, and they have to make the same amount of bricks that they were making before, even though they have so much more work. So now the children of Israel are suffering even more intensely than they were before Moses ever came back. And Moses cries out to God and says, "What are you doing, Lord? It seems like you haven't even delivered your people at all, and their lives have only gotten worse since I've been here." And God basically at the beginning of chapter 6 tells Moses, "Wait and watch and see what I'm going to do." Now we arrived at the kind of overview of that section of scripture where they hear this fantastic news that they're going to be delivered, that they're going to be set free from their enslavement, right? But then immediately after that, their lives get worse because their slavery intensifies, okay? And all that they have to go on is this promise from the Lord, right? And we talked last week about how, God works things out in a way that's very different than the way that we would work things out. And we get a promise and we immediately want that promise in our own two hands, right? But God has a lot of things that he's trying to work out because he wants things done in a particular way, right? For his own glory. Now, another thing that he does to us when he gives us a promise, very rarely do we just get it immediately, right? There's usually a waiting period. But one of the things that he does to us in that waiting period is he tries to teach us something either that we need to know right in that moment or that we're going to need to know further down the line. And as I read through Exodus from this section where they first hear of their deliverance all the way up until they actually get into the wilderness, one thing that I observe that the Lord was trying to teach the people of Israel was how to look for him in the middle of their crises. Because, like I said, the people get great news. They're really excited. They finally get the promise, okay? Their lives immediately become worse. And now they're angry at God, saying, we thought our enslavement was already bad. Now it's even worse. Now we might even die. But then what happens immediately after that is some absolutely astounding things, right? Because even though their enslavement was worse, Now, all of a sudden, they start seeing miracles in the form of the plagues. Because God then turns the Nile River into blood. Then he floods the land with frogs and locusts and gnats, and he brings boils upon the Egyptians, and darkness and hail, and then eventually the death of the firstborn. And meanwhile, all of this stuff is happening, and the children of Israel are still slaves. That's a very, very fascinating place to be in. You kind of got to put yourself in that position of, man, what would I be thinking at that moment where I've been a slave my entire life? I've been suffering from my circumstances for my entire life. Then God promises that he's going to take me out of it and he's going to answer my prayers to be delivered. And so all of a sudden I've got this mood booster. I am excited and ready for the promises of God. But then my circumstance immediately gets worse than it's ever been before. And I'm suffering more intensely than I've ever suffered in my life. But at the same time that my suffering intensifies, I see the hand of God more mightily than I have ever seen it before. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what would you be doing? What would you be thinking in that moment? And if we observe carefully, we will see the parallel between what happens to the children of Israel while they're still in their enslavement in Egypt, and what happens to the children of Israel once they are free and they're walking through the wilderness, right? Like we've said, the promise comes, they're really happy about it, but then everything gets worse, but they still see God, okay? Now, when the children of Israel are delivered, that's like the climax of the whole story, right? They finally come out of Egypt and they're going to the promised land. So they're really excited because they get this promise, it's fulfilled, they're set free and they're no longer slaves. So that's great, everybody's happy. But things immediately get worse because now they don't have homes and they have no food, and Pharaoh's going to chase them down, and they're going to be thirsty and they're going to be hungry and they're going to think that they're going to die. So everything in their life is still going to get bad, even though the promise of deliverance has been fulfilled, right? But at the same time that everything's bad, they're going to see the hand of God work mightily, because he's going to be there in the form of a pillar of cloud, in a pillar of fire by night. He's going to make manna appear on the ground. He's going to bring water forth from the rocks. They're going to encounter hostile people, but he's going to give them victory by the lifted rod of Moses. All of these things are going to happen. So it's exactly like a mirror of each other in terms of circumstances. There's a promise given that they're really happy about, but they don't see the result immediately, and they suffer in the meantime during the waiting. But then all throughout the waiting, God is working miracles and exceptional, mighty things on their behalf. Now, like I said earlier in the beginning, what was God trying to teach them to do? I believe that God was trying to teach them to look for him. The people suffering as slaves in Egypt were going to endure this incredibly hard lifestyle, harder than it had ever been for them because of the order of Pharaoh, right? But he was going to be working on their behalf. The Lord was going to be working on their behalf more than he had ever done before. And they could choose to look at their suffering and how much harder their life was and how much worse their life was, or they could choose to look at what God was doing for them and choose to watch him instead. And they were going to have to learn that lesson if they were going to be able to endure the wilderness, because the exact same set of circumstances was going to come to them in the wilderness. They were going to have great joy for a moment, but then suffering was going to come in ways that they had not encountered before. They had food in Egypt. They had water in Egypt. They weren't going to have any of that in the wilderness. So their life was going to be harder in ways that it had never been harder before. But if while in Egypt they would have learned to look for the Lord in the midst of that suffering and waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, then they would not have had to go through the complaining against God that they did in the wilderness, and ultimately it kept them out of the promised land. See, God was trying to teach them to look for him in the midst of their difficult circumstances and see the way that he was going to work on their behalf so that they could, by faith, keep walking and going towards the promise until he ultimately fulfilled it. And unfortunately, we know that they did not learn that lesson. They did not learn that lesson, and it cost them the promise. And so, I would ask you, if God has given you a promise right now, like we said last week, he's definitely going to fulfill it because he's going to do what he says he's going to do. Now, your life might get worse in the meantime. There's no guarantee that that's not going to happen. But he's still going to do what he said he's going to do. And odds are he's working something on your behalf even right now as you're watching this video. He's working something out for you. But what are you looking at? Are you looking for him and looking to see how he is working and the things that he is doing in order to bring about what he's promised you? Or are you looking at the difficulty of your circumstance? Because ultimately, when he does deliver and when he does bring you that promise that he said he was going to do, you can have that promise and have learned the lesson with it so that in that next season of life, you can be sustained by what the Lord has taught you, or you can walk into that promise completely uneducated and unprepared for what lies ahead because you were so focused on what you were enduring and what you were suffering that you couldn't see the way that he was working. And ultimately, as you go into this next season of your life, where God is taking you next, we don't know, but are we prepared because we saw him before and so we witness the work of God and we now have the testimony of the way that he works on our behalf, and that testimony carries us into the future, into our next season, into our next lesson as God continues to move in our lives and give us new promises for the times ahead. The children of Israel didn't learn in Egypt, and so it cost them in the wilderness. So if you're stuck right now in between a rock and a hard place, I'm suffering here at this moment, but God's got a promise and here I am in the middle and I just don't know where I'm going. Look for him. You need to stop. You need to be prayerful. You need to look for him. Look for the ways that he is working on your behalf. Stay focused on that, because ultimately when God does what he says he's going to do, you're going to have the promise, but there's also some wisdom and some lessons that he's trying to impart to you in that waiting process. So look for him now. And then when you're on the other side of the promise and there's a whole new wilderness and a whole new set of circumstances, you're going to be wiser because you learned the first time. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope this was encouraging to you. Please pray for me. I will be traveling to Greece. Actually, I think today by the time this video goes up. So please pray for me as I'm traveling. Thank you so much. Bye.